Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. Today is February 18th in Kiev. It is now 7:41 a.m., and we continue our daily morning reflections on what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. Well, perhaps it is not the most productive use of our time, but obviously the most significant event happening today is this. It is currently the second full day of important diplomatic negotiations in Geneva, specifically the tripartite talks. High-level Russian, American, and Ukrainian representatives are all holding these critical negotiations in Geneva right now. Supposedly, as they say in the reports, they are talking extensively about how they might finally bring a definitive end to this ongoing war. So, well, just yesterday afternoon, in fact, if we take a close look at who is representing the parties and who is heading the delegations, basically, that fact in and of itself could be more than enough to completely put an end to any further commentary on the matter, because when the Russian delegation is headed by, representing the Russian side, is Vladimir Medinsky, while on the American side, Vitek and Zaitek are also participating, with Steve Witkoff serving as the official head leading the entire delegation. Well, from here on, I don't really feel like talking about it, but I have to, because in reality, there are several specific aspects that make us take all of this very seriously, and there are good reasons for that. I'll try to explain it all to you now. So, well, actually, the meeting itself, the negotiations themselves, which lasted 6 hours, were closed to the public. But here is what is particularly interesting. In fact, absolutely no one really knew exactly what happened there at the time. But there were some official statements, and there was a certain complex background, like various interviews with the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, which clearly showed his specific position. After all, when you think about it, that is the most important thing. There were also some significant statements and certain actions taken from the Russian side as well. So that also clearly demonstrated what the overall Russian position was. But I want to say once again, and emphasize this point, since the situation remains, as the old saying goes, everyone always talks about the things that hurt them the most. And for me personally, journalism is exactly what hurts. And so once again today, I find myself wanting to, let's say, deeply lament the current state of the Western press and media, because when it comes to the Russian press, there's no point in lamenting anymore since there's nothing left to be sad about. So this time around, The Economist wrote a very interesting piece. So the specific column, it is called the War Room Newsletter, and this time they have published a detailed article titled, "Is a Peace Agreement Possible?" And there within the text, they explore several key points. Oliver Carroll. In this column, featured in this newsletter, we analyze the prospects and the pitfalls of ending the war in Ukraine. So, here's what he writes. As it has recently come to light, against the backdrop of ongoing negotiations, the Ukrainian delegation has faced significant internal disagreements. So part of the negotiators, as The Economist writes, are of the firm opinion that Ukraine would benefit from a swiftly negotiated peace settlement brokered by the United States, because they fear the window of opportunity may soon close. This group, as it turns out, according to the reports from The Economist. So this specific group, well, it is not exactly a formal group, but basically, in short, it consists of Kirilo Budanov and the influential head of the president's office. It turns out, as The Economist has recently discovered, he has opponents who are closely aligned with the previous head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, who do not want a quick peace. Moreover, it turns out, as the publication The Economist found out, that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is carefully balancing between these positions. So, President Zelensky's position, it has absolutely not changed throughout all of this time. He has repeatedly stated that We stand where we stand, that Kyiv is not going to give away its territory. This applies to absolutely anyone whatsoever. And in this regard, well, actually, since the main issue we are currently dealing with is territory, I have a specific question that I would like to pose to the representative from The Economist magazine. Where did you get this information? There are several such questions. The first one, does it mean that Budanov, by advocating for a quick peace, is suggesting to surrender territory? Else it is impossible. What does it mean to want a quick peace? Everyone wants peace quickly. Both Zelensky and Putin are also for a quick peace. It's just that everyone has different ideas about the terms. So, considering all of this, what exactly does it imply? That there are certain points of disagreement? Does it mean that Budanov is suggesting to surrender territory? Because, well, there simply is no other interpretation of advocating for a quick peace. It just doesn't exist. In fact, this is a substantive position of some kind. So this means that in order to reach a quick peace, one must agree to Musk's terms and surrender territory. If that is truly the case, and if indeed, according to reports from The Economist, Budanov is advocating for a quick peace by proposing to make significant concessions and surrender sovereign territory, then we must ask how the head of the president's office can hold a position that is so diametrically opposed to that of his direct and immediate superior. This leads us to a second important question. Who exactly among the leadership is taking their cues from Yermak, and what does that mean for the country? Well, I don't know for sure. Maybe they are referring to local mayors, or maybe it's someone else entirely. In any case, who exactly is this supposedly terrible person who is allegedly acting as Yermak's agent within this delegation? And now we come to the third and most important question of all, because while those first questions can still be discussed in some way, yes, indeed, let us use our imagination for a moment, that Budanov, aspiring to a significant political role, and let us say, if Budanov truly has presidential ambitions, if he really wants that, so to speak, although that is also quite far-fetched. It is so far-fetched that the main point is not whether he might have presidential ambitions. Of course, it is entirely possible he could have those presidential ambitions. The fundamental problem is simply that, so to speak, achieving a quick peace under these specific terms would mean giving up significant territories, but that is something that will not happen. Well, all right, let's suppose so, but the most important and completely fantastical claim is about what exactly Zelensky's balancing act consists of, if we take into account that he is not going to give away any territories. That is, from my point of view, The Economist is following the path of the Financial Times. Recently, we talked about how the Financial Times reported that Zelensky on the 24th would announce elections and a referendum, but it immediately turned out that this was not the case. Zelensky himself said that it was the first he'd heard of it and that he wasn't planning to announce anything of the sort. In short, he immediately congratulated the Financial Times on their blunder. And now it's The Economist's turn. First, let's talk about what's actually happening in reality, just simply the reality. And this is all quite obvious. And even without entering that private room where the negotiations took place, the situation remains more or less clear anyway. Because there is the institution of reputation, there is a credit history. Vladimir Medinsky is a highly prominent figure. He is exceptionally well known to all of us, an outstanding specialist on the historical myths about Russia and on the Pechenegs. Recently, very recently, a group of pro-Putin writers elected him to serve as their leader, the chairman of the Union of Writers of Russia. So he is a well-known, understandable figure. His real task is to put on a circus and cause a significant disruption. Any real, genuine negotiations, in other words, to create some benefits, to settle in, to fool around, and to tell historical fairy tales. So it is abundantly clear that by specifically appointing Vladimir Medinsky to serve as the head of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Putin is simply demonstrating to the world that all of these ongoing diplomatic negotiations are nothing more than a symbolic gesture. It's all nonsense. Just a smokescreen behind which Putin intends to continue the war. That is, supposedly participating in negotiations, supposedly making some statements, no matter what they are, while in reality continuing the war. In other words, Medinsky, unlike Kostyukov, Admiral Kostyukov, the head of the main intelligence directorate, is not capable of saying anything concrete. That is, he is not capable even of holding any preliminary talks, preliminary agreements about how to withdraw troops, how to monitor a ceasefire, and so on. He is not capable. So, essentially, what this means is that Putin, considering that Trump is now mainly trying to put significant pressure on Ukraine, is constantly declaring that Ukraine must agree to sit down at the negotiating table. Yes, Ukraine is already at the negotiating table. Why compel them through force to sit down? But Trump still, so to speak, persistently continues his efforts to exert significant pressure on Ukraine. And that's why, for Putin, he firmly believes that right now he's still experiencing a streak of good fortune. So, the absolute and undeniable fact regarding these ongoing diplomatic negotiations is that Russia is absolutely not going to ever agree to anything at all. That is the current situation. Literally just now, it happened. A publication in TASS stated that the decision to recognize the Donetsk region must be officially acknowledged by all of the negotiating parties involved. That is to say, both Ukraine and the US must officially recognize, that the Donbas region is now Russian. Just literally the day before, I mentioned that while we know very little about what exactly goes on inside this consultation room, we certainly do know what happens outside of it. And then, just on the very eve of these negotiations, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin proposed introducing external governance over Ukraine. Well, you see, this isn't just some Solovyov or some other kind of scum from the television. This is, in fact, the Deputy Foreign Minister himself on the eve, literally just before the negotiations. So this is a deliberate provocation specifically intended to humiliate Ukraine. On exactly what grounds? Ukraine is at war, defending itself from an aggressor. On what specific grounds should external governance be introduced to address these issues? It is also certainly worth mentioning just how remarkably clear to everyone the entire matter has become. Steve Witkoff and Medinsky form a distinct and powerful tandem. In fact, Witkoff is well known for his unique way of perceiving the world. He's just like a vessel for being filled with Russian disinformation. He absorbed everything from Dmitriev, and now he tries to pour it all into the ears of the people of Putin. How long were they there? They talked for 5 hours, if I'm not mistaken, with Putin. So he pours all the contents of these conversations into Trump's ears in exactly the same way. Everything Medinsky says, he will carefully absorb every single word of it. To put it quite simply and briefly, this pair will be performing their own version of classic comic duets. So this is exactly the kind of unique alliance that has already formed, because they speak the same language, which is honestly completely incomprehensible to ordinary everyday people. So, and that's exactly why in this situation, essentially, these are not actually trilateral negotiations, but rather a situation of two parties against one. So in this specific configuration, it's Russia and the United States of America against Ukraine. That is basically how the setup is arranged. It's very clear that the Ukrainian delegation has no intention of falling for any tricks here. So, in any case, as for the Ukrainian delegation, it's clear that during these negotiations, Russia will not agree to withdraw its troops. During these talks, Russia will not agree to a ceasefire based on the hold where we are formula. It's more or less clear that in the course of these negotiations, essentially nothing will happen. Once again, the question arises, where exactly did the economist see Zelensky balancing his position? Just recently, right at the moment when the negotiations first began, Zelensky gave a very extensive interview to the well-known publication Axios, and it was here that he clearly stated, once again for everyone to hear, that a unilateral withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Donbas region is absolutely impossible to consider. The truth is that the people of Ukraine would never be able to forgive such a decision. They would not forgive him personally. They would not forgive. This is to the government of the United States of America, and this is an integral part of our sovereign territory, so it is absolutely impossible, says the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. In other words, I emphasize that all this was said not at some point in the past, but at the very moment when high-level diplomatic negotiations were currently being conducted in Geneva. Moreover, at the specific moment when this particular interview was being recorded, a session which ended up lasting for approximately 40 minutes in total, President Zelensky made it very clear that regardless of the various circumstances involved, regardless of the specific content, no matter what the final summary entails, and whatever the ultimate agreement turns out to be, it must be submitted to a full public referendum. Furthermore, if this potential agreement implies a unilateral withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donbas region, then this entire agreement will be firmly rejected by the people. And the question arises, where, from what place, from what finger, or whatever else, where exactly did the economists get the idea that President Zelensky is wavering in his position? At this moment, the entire situation remains completely unclear. That is, in fact, this is, of course, sad. Now we're already talking about the state of journalism, and that's sad. Here, The Economist is following in the footsteps of the Financial Times by publishing fakes. It's depressing, both of them, after all. These are quality publications. These are expert publications. And so, against the backdrop of such a reputation and such provocations, before moving on to answering your questions, my dear friends, I want to say that today at 8 o'clock p.m. sharp, we have a very special conversation scheduled with Mikhail Pavlovich Scheichelman. I think it will be incredibly interesting, so please don't miss it. So, questions. I will now begin answering your questions. Looking back under yesterday's stream, and I still have some unresolved and pending questions from the day before yesterday as well, but apparently I'll have to get to those tomorrow. This is because there are well over 100 questions, and of course I simply won't be able to answer them all in just one morning stream. So yes, in this case, naturally, since yesterday I spoke about Navalny's agonizing execution, there are, of course, many questions, and not just questions, but critical remarks as well. Looking at the big picture, I find myself in what one might describe as a rather amusing situation, if you can even call it that, especially against the backdrop of such a deeply tragic topic. The truth is, throughout this entire recent period, well, not just recent, let's say over the course of the last 20 long years, I have consistently been a very harsh, and I would even go so far as to say a fierce and relentless critic of Alexei Navalny regarding, so to speak, his stance on Russian marches, his position on Georgia, his position on smart voting, and so on. and in general his working style and other things as well. And as it happens now, it turns out that I have to provide a defense for him, although really, given his current situation, he no longer needs any defense. Well, anyway, let's talk about it.